Hi everyone, welcome to the second video in our fall webinar series. If you missed the first one, we did a curve fitting workshop, but this one is about style. No, not that kind of style. This video is about creating graphs with style. In particular, we're going to be using the APA style guide, although the information here would be useful for anyone who's making graphs for any kind of publication or presentation. And we're going to show you not just what the style guidelines are, but how to implement those guidelines using DataGraph for macOS. The webinar begins with about a 20-minute presentation all about the style guide, where we give you an introduction, a bunch of example figures that we're going to show you. Then we'll get into the meat of what's in the APA style guide and how to get these settings in DataGraph. This is followed by a live demo showing you how to do this within DataGraph, and then we had a great question and answer period as well. If you have any questions while you're watching this, then please feel free to put them in the comments. You can always email us, help@visualdatatools.com. So here it is. Here's the complete webinar we presented, creating figures using the APA style guide. The webinar itself today is what we're calling our fall series. This is the second webinar that we've done this fall. We took a little break over the summer. I know it's not technically fall yet, but it's really close. Actually, here in North Carolina today, it does not feel like fall at all. But I know it is around the corner. It has really been hot the past couple of days. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Pamela Schultz. I'm with Visual Data Tools. And I wanted to, again, start with a presentation, and then we'll get into showing you some examples in DataGraph. First, my introduction to the APA style guide happened really in the beginning of this year. My own background is as a chemist and an environmental engineer. I don't use the APA style guide per se for the journals that I've published in. However, I did go ahead and buy a copy of the guide. And the focus for us today is going to be on the figures related to the guide. But I had a couple of users who contacted me. One actually was related to doing linear regressions and needing to format a number in the way that you see here, where if you notice, there is an absence of a leading zero in front of the R value. That is a format that I was not familiar with, but that's something that's required by the APA style guide. And we've added this. You can now do this in DataGraph because of that request. And then I also was contacted about creating some figures that were consistent with the guide, but also had this really clean, very modern look to them. And as I've looked through some of the journals that are in the APA domain, I've really been impressed with how many of the graphics are really clean, very clear, modern looking, and have this nice aesthetic associated with them. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And how do you create graphs that look like this in DataGraph? As I said, I purchased myself a copy of the APA style guide, the 7th edition, and the guide itself has a lot of different aspects to it. It talks about how to write papers, the publication process itself. I've certainly used the APA guide for how do I format my references in the past, but our focus is on the tables and figures. You can also go to the APA style guide website and get a lot of the information that I'm going to talk about today from there as well. I'm not going to read this. I don't like very busy slides. I did copy this from the APA website in terms of specifically for figures, what do they recommend? I just wanted to point out that there's several different aspects to presenting a figure in a publication. It's not only the figure itself. How do you display the number, the title, the legend, and a note? Again, all of this is from the web. I did want to point out that you'll notice right here, very specific recommendations for the font type. Otherwise, these are a little bit more general, but still are telling you how to set a figure up in a paper. Oops, wrong. There we go. So this would be a completed figure. This is one that I made in DataGraph. And the figure itself has a number, has a title, again, has the note at the bottom, but there is something wrong with this figure. Can you see what it is on your screen? There is a problem with this. It is very, very badly scaled. The font in the image of the graph itself, because this here, this part of the graphic is an image. It's embedded in a document where I pasted this into, but you have to make sure that the image sizing and font are scaled properly so that the whole thing looks correct when we have it in a document. So it's one of the things that we'll talk about today. I'm going to see if I can turn off my, you don't really need to see my keystrokes right now. Okay, there we go. And there's a comment that came to the host that I'll go ahead and this didn't go to everyone, but a perspective about Cleveland, Bill Cleveland, Tufty. These are, you know, people who are very instrumental in how graphs are formatted and created. And I didn't reference any of their information for this particular webinar. I actually did a webinar about Bill Cleveland a couple of years ago. Maybe I'll go ahead and see if I can find a link to that and also refer to that to you. But absolutely, modern and clean shouldn't interfere with clear communication. I agree with that comment very much. And yet it is, you know, that I maybe someone can say on the chat, there's Edward Tufty has a famous quote about the pen to ink ratio and that we shouldn't have lines that aren't necessary. I do think that in a lot of journals, you see graphs that do have a lot of unnecessary elements to them and can at times be busy. But this is what we're going to strive for today, is making these nice looking modern graphs. Okay, so badly scaled, how do we fix this? Well, this is something we're going to handle within the context today using DataGraph. But here you can see a graph that is properly scaled where I can read the font on the graph itself and the whole thing looks nice and balanced. Looks good. Let's talk a little bit about the defaults that are in DataGraph versus the APA style guide. First of all, if I make a side-by-side bar graph in DataGraph using the defaults as we have them set up, it will look like this. This is not a bad graph. It is relatively clean looking. In fact, that's one of the things we often get comments about from DataGraph, that it creates out of the box really nice, clean looking graphs. Well, here's the same graph interpreted using an example from the APA website, modeling in some ways one of the examples that they present, because they have a series of example figures that is both in the book as well as online. And I like this graph. This is also, I made this in DataGraph. There's a couple of things in particular that I like about this. One is that there is a difference in terms of the bars with no color, and then a pattern. So it's very clear what bar corresponds to what element that is in our legend here. Another thing that's very common in the graphs that you see with the style guide, although they don't specifically say this, that I could find in the guide, typically there's no minor tick marks. DataGraph by default will add a minor tick mark in between your major tick marks. The tick marks are often smaller in the APA graphs that I see, and sometimes there just aren't any tick marks at all. And this is an example where by default, what we do is we put the tick marks when you have categories in between the categories. Here you don't have any, and it's true, you don't necessarily need it. This graph looks fine without it. Here's an example of a linear regression, very simple data set with a 95% confidence interval around the fit. What might this look like if we were going to put this in an APA format? Here's an example here. A couple of other things to note. You'll see that there's a bold font assigned to the X and Y titles. That's something that's consistent. Already talked about the absence of the leading zero whenever you have a number that you know will never go above 1. And I just added in a little bit of color just to make this look a little nicer. This is actually very similar to what one of the users of DataGraph who contacted me had a graph with a similar color scheme, and I thought it looked very nice. Here's another example. And this is actually a graph that I just made up some data. You can see x-axis fruit and vegetables and values. This is a graphic that's made using the box command in DataGraph. I probably should have put that on the screen just so you would know that. So it looks like points. People often have come to me asking to make graphs like this, and they go to the points command because that's what it's called and that's what they see. But the points command is really for scatter graphs. The box command is where we can represent a distribution of points in a variety of ways. Default is box and whisker, but there is a points option that will show you all the points in a particular group and arrange them in the way that you see here. In the prior version of DataGraph, we are releasing a new version on September 1st. This graph would actually be very hard to do because if you have your points that are big or a lot of them, in the past, we never allowed overlaps, but now we do, and you can create a graphic that looks like this. And this is a style that I was asked to see if I could make in DataGraph, and you will be able to make this. You can use the current beta version to make a graphic like this, and you can get the new version that we're also going to put out on just a couple of days from now. And this is also showing you the line where the mean value is. This is all made with actually two box commands layered one on top of the other. And again, very minimalist style in terms of the way the labels are and also the y-axis. I thought it would be fun to also add color because this, kind of looks nice as well to have a little bit of color associated with the graphic. Now let's talk about how do we apply these style settings within DataGraph? Or actually, sorry, I'm skipping ahead to the next section. What are the style settings? So now we're going to talk about the actual style guide recommendations. These are a combination of the specifics that come into the style guide versus things that I have noticed in terms of making the graph consistent with what you can do in DataGraph. Here, for example, you see font type, sans serif Arial. You can use any sans serif font, but an Arial font is one of the ones that they recommend. You can use that. 8-point is the minimum. You can go up to 14, although I found that on another website. I actually didn't find that in the guide, but that seems reasonable to me. But 8 is the minimum. You don't want to go below. Line thickness of 0.5. This is the default within DataGraph. XY title font, you can make that, again, bold. The error bar color, in DataGraph, we actually have a default of red, but here you want to change this to black. The box style is an option you have within DataGraph, which we've actually improved giving you more options for this. But here, what you see is the box style means the style here, what's around the XY coordinate system. And you, in this version, the option in DataGraph that would match would be called only axis. Again, tick marks, no minor tick marks, they tend to be smaller. The legend, one of the things that they recommend is that the legend is not to the side of your graph, but they want the legend to be either contained within the graph itself. In fact, this graphic is a recreation of one of the examples that is on the website for APA. I just made some similar data and made this graph in DataGraph. They showed the legend within the graphic itself, but within the guide, they recommend that one option that's acceptable is to put the legend below. So I thought that was a nice option to show there. But I will point out one of the styles, again, that they recommend so that you can really tell what data corresponds to what legend entry is also using different symbols for each line graph that's shown here. So you'll notice not only different colors, but different symbols. So this would work well if I printed this in black and white. By default, when you create DataGraph plots, they will, if I'm making a different plot command, it'll have the same symbol for each one, and you just can go in and pick a different symbol for the different data. Okay, so the APA style guide, in terms of sizing, I found on the web a note about the maximum width being 7.2 inches and the maximum height being 6 inches. What I suggest in terms of if you're using a journal that's going to have a two-column format is that one column would work at about 3.25 inches to 2.5, and the width of a two-column image 6.5 inches by 2.5, for example. So these are just suggestions from me that I've been using, but you would check your particular journal in terms of figuring out what style size you are, what size of graph that you want to use. Okay, settings in DataGraph. So first of all, DataGraph has a style setting that is zoomed in here. Here's the object. And if you want to see where it is within any graph, this is where you can find the style setting object within the, again, within the user interface. What I did here is I expanded open the style settings, and I'm going to go ahead into DataGraph in a moment and show you this. But basically, these are all the things that I changed within the default style settings to get a style that corresponds to this APA format. You can see, for example, changing the font to Arial 8 point. In DataGraph, we have these font categories. So I can take my XY title font, I can leave it the same font as Arial, but I can bump up the size a little bit. So I can make this a bold font. For example, again, the XY titles are bold, and change this to 10%. So this scheme we have of the font categories actually really works well with this need to follow that format. The box style, by default, we have a box around the whole thing. Change that to only axis. Change the size of the tick marks to small. Sometimes you might want them bigger, but I, again, often see them a smaller size. And you can uncheck this box right here to remove any minor tick marks. I guess the last thing that I will show you here is the colors. This is where you can change the colors that are in the color menu, and the color in the center is what is used for error bars. If you want that to always be black, just change the color tile here. By default, we have it red. If you want to set, or once you set your style settings, you don't have to set it in one place and then repeat that for every graph. Just set it in one graph, and then you can set those styles across all of your graphs at once. One way within the same file is to use the gear menu and set the same style for every graph is the option that you can use to do that. And you can also go between files. You can copy these objects, select the objects, do a copy, go to another graph in another file, and then paste, and those styles will be applied there. So it's when I was doing the preparation for this webinar, I just made one style setting set up the way that I just showed you, and then I just copy and pasted that between my graphs. Another thing that you're going to want to do is set the image size. Again, this gets back to how everything is scaled. So you will change the size from being something that changes with the sliding bars to a specified value. And then you get a box that pops up asking, well, what do you want that to be? And here I have, again, I've typed in, the width and the height that will scale properly with a single column graph. If the graph then looks small, go ahead and change the zoom on the graph so that you can see the graph within the context of DataGraph much better. Okay, last one here before we go into DataGraph is the in the axis settings. There's just a couple of things I wanted to point out here because these are settings that I was commonly changing when I made some of the examples for this webinar. So I thought I would point these out to you. First of all, the padding for X. This is when you have padding between the data and the sides of the graph. You have control over that here. I found that 10% when I had by default, DataGraph will put those tick marks on the side. But when you remove those, if you have a categorical axis and you uncheck the ticks box here, then it helps sometimes to change this padding to make it the bars get a little closer to the edge. And also the amount of space that you have between the edge of the graph and your y-axis, changing this setting as well. And I think that is all of the, yeah, that is all I have in terms of presentation. So let's now go into DataGraph. And how I wanted to illustrate this for you is by using one of our sets of examples here. This is the themes. So within DataGraph, you know, you have all these example files you can go to. If you go to the section that's called themes, we have 4 of them there now. We're going to be adding another one. But if you want to open up the top one, this is the default theme for DataGraph that would be similar to that first side-by-side bar chart, for example, that I showed you. And when you open this up, you see a variety of different graph types. And again, they're using the default. I'm not changing much here beyond what it is within DataGraph. These other themes are really set up so for examples that you can use, but also just to give you a sense of all the things that you can control when you're using the program. So let's start with the style settings. And what I'm going to do here, let me actually turn my key strokes on. So first I'm going to use Command D to hide the, side panel. And then I'm going to do Shift Command D to move the settings over to the left-hand side. And I don't need to necessarily see the data. But okay, so what am I going to do first here? So I'm going to open up the style settings and I'm going to change those things that I talked about. So changing the font. Now this looks smaller because it's scaling again to a proper font for publication, which might look a little small on your screen. So we can go ahead and bump up again this size here so that you can see this much better on your screen. What else do I want to do? I want to change the XY title font, leave it the same as the main font, but change this to bold. And I like to bump the size up just a little bit. This actually only has a Y font, so I could say, just type something in for the X title as well, so that you can see that. The other thing that I want to do here is I want to change the box style to, for example, it could be only axis. Now I only have this line along the edge, but the other thing that I can do is, well, a couple of things that we've added. This is, again, for the new version of DataGraph, you have an option for just no box, which we just didn't have before. Now, when you do that and you're using the box command, you'll see now that it's a little bit offset from 0 so that the edge of the bars don't overlap your labels that you might have there. So we'll go ahead and leave that with none. The other thing that I'm going to do is down here with the tick marks, change the size to small. I'm going to uncheck the minor tick marks, tick marks. And I think that's pretty much it. I guess I don't have error bars on this, but again, if you want to change this to black, then if you apply this style to another graph, you know that your error bars will be black. So now this looks like it's more akin to the ones that we saw before. If I wanted to change this size, again, by default, it's 5 inches by 3 inches, but I could make this, again, my 3.25 inches. Sorry, I didn't convert these to centimeters beforehand. I probably should have, by 2.5. Again, you could do it in centimeters, you can do it in inches. One really handy thing, if you're going to use that size over and over again, then in this gear menu, just to the right of that size, you can add it to this list. I actually have already added it, but if you type in a size that's not on this list, click the gear menu, and the option you'll see is add size to list or something like that. Anyway, so now I have it sized for a single column graph. I can, what were some of the other things I talked about? Oh, let's expand this open. Actually, there really isn't much that I set here. In addition, you could change the margins if you like. I tend to leave them to automatic. These graphs do have a title on them, so I might want the font style for this to match my X and Y titles that I already set up. So I could do that here with the title font option. If I want to go into here, again, those couple of other options that I told you about that are in the axis settings, padding for X, maybe I'll decrease that a little bit to bump my bars out, or sorry, change it from the nice value, the automatic value, to a 10% value. You could make it even less if you want it to go out to 5%. I kind of like 10%. The space between the edge of the axis and the edge of the graph, this is what we call the space for X or Y. You can change that here within the axis settings, but what I do all the time, because this is a setting that I commonly have to change depending on my data, just right click or two fingers on your touchpad, and you can see the Y, here it is, Y space option will be, in this case, I want to change that to narrow. So that looks a lot nicer. Again, just right click over here by the axis and you get these options. Another thing you'll notice in the new version is there are more options here that I think are organized a little bit better. So you can change the box style directly from the graph, the grid lines, minor grid lines, and the tick marks you can change here too. If you want no tick marks, you can set that here, for example. But within the axis settings is where you can specify the tick mark locations, how you want the tick marks organized. And when you have an axis that's categorical, like I do here, I have categories, text categories, not numerical values on my x-axis, you'll see this box right here that you can uncheck if you want to have no ticks there. That looks pretty good. Now, the other types of settings that we saw were settings related to the bars themselves. If you recall, the bars that were in that example were narrow. Well, those are things that we would set within the command. But before I do that, why don't I go ahead and show you what I just think is maybe the most important lesson from this entire webinar, is the ability to now apply these settings to all of my graphs, because I don't want to have to do this again, right? I just spent all the time setting up my style settings. So go to the gear menu and say, set same style for every graph. Now, when I go to each of the graphs here, no, actually also let me set the same size. I can do the same thing with this one, set same size for every graph. And I'll zoom this one up to 150 as well. So now this looks, you can see it here maybe with this one too. This looks just like this one. There's a little tweaking that you need to do here and there. Actually, I guess I didn't set this to, here we go. Kind of want all these to be bigger. Yeah, so now there we go. So I set the same canvas settings for all my graphs. So now you can see these. And now personally, I would want to have axis lines when I have numerical axes like this for a line plot or a scatter plot. So here I would probably go ahead and right click and say, you know what, here I want the box style to be only axis. So I have axis lines. I could do the same thing here. So getting used to not always going into the style settings and knowing what options are available to you from the window of the graph itself, I think is a really handy thing. And if I want to apply this to other graphs and other files, let me just demonstrate that. I can go to this file or go to this graph. Again, I'm highlighting this style setting. And I can actually do more than that. I can highlight multiple at a time, but let's just do the style setting. So I'm going to say edit, copy. Now let's go to the online examples and open just a completely different graph. Maybe we'll open up, I don't know, let's do this one. This is kind of nice looking one. So right now the style is just pretty much all the default. There's just a single plot command here. Now I can do edit paste. And now this graph is in that same style. Actually, I guess since this is a line plot, I probably want this one. And might as well do both of these at the same time. So I can say edit, copy, go to this other file. I have the graph I wanted selected. Now I'm going to say edit, paste. And now that graph is in the same style as the other ones that I did. So again, manipulating the style, you have control over that, and you can apply it easily between files and between other graphs. And also now that I have this within this file, I can do the same thing. I can say, set the same style for every graph, set the same canvas for every graph. And now they all have a very similar look to them. Are there any other? So I see, okay, there's one. Does the style set in DataGraph refer to the saved style for all of the parameters? The way that the language that we use to refer to these are two different things. First of all, we say the layout settings are all of these. All of these objects right here are all considered part of the layout settings. And within them, you have these three objects. The style settings is the top one, then the canvas, then the axis settings. If you go to the help for these pages, so I just clicked the gear menu, I clicked help. This brings me to the DataGraph reference manual that's online. And in here, in the online manual, you'll see how there's a section for the layout settings, and there's an article for each of these, the style, the canvas, the axis. You can also split the axes using the canvas settings. So there's also a page that shows you all about if you want to split in either direction, what does that look like and how does that work? So this may be helpful to see them. I found that when I first started using DataGraph, one of the things I did a lot was this hover, where I would hover my mouse over the object to remind myself which one they are. Now, the style setting itself, this is it's meant to mimic the icon and artist palette. That's why it's the fonts, the colors, the line styles are all what you change within the context of the style settings. A more basic question, can you show what the data look like that are generating these graphs? I skipped one question. Let me get to that first. So the data for these graphs is all here. If I want to see this more directly, I can do the Shift Command D and bring the data table over to the left-hand side and show you. This is just the simple data that's in this particular file. I will say one thing, DataGraph has different approaches that you can use depending on what your style of data is. There are some commands that expect kind of a wide format where you have a category like the bars command, and then you have multiple columns of data. But many of the other commands work best. For example, we have a pivot command, and for that you want a long set of data. Data that's not in a wide format, but a long format. I think there's actually some explanation of that on our website. And in fact, we have a command or a shortcut for flattening a data set. It's grayed out here because I'm not really selecting anything. But if I select this data and I said data flatten columns, it's going to take that data, pivot it backwards or reverse pivot and make it a long set of data. So I don't know if that really helps, but I like to say that because often when people say, how do I make this graph? My response is, can you show me what your data looks like? Because the best, most convenient way to make the graph is probably going to depend on the format of the data. And I also like to tell people the data that's in the most raw format that you have is what I would recommend trying to bring into DataGraph rather than calculating your standard deviations somewhere else and bringing that already in. If you can bring in the raw data and use the pivot command to calculate those statistics, then you have it all done in one place. And it actually sometimes is a lot easier to set up those graphs. let me see. I think I skipped, would the data change when you copy the style from one file to another file? No. And that's exactly the point. So again, that question, would the data change when you copy the style from one file to another file? DataGraph uses this approach of it's kind of similar to the way websites are. You know, when a website is created, there's all this text that's on the web page, but the web pages have styles that are associated with the page that are completely separate from the content. And that's how this is working here. I can actually make a new graph, and that's actually another thing that I really wanted to point out. Once you change the style in a particular file, so I've changed this style setting here. Now the next graph that I create will have that style that I've set. So again, you don't have to keep, if you always want Arial 8 point, when I make another graph, it's also going to be Arial 8 point. But if I change my mind on this graph and I want it times, now when I make another graph to the right of this, that graph will also be times. So that's, I think, kind of an important thing to understand. But I guess the short answer is no, it's not changing your data. It's just the style of it. So I could take, any graph and take the style settings and copy and apply it to that graph. So let me see. Okay, we talked about the data. Then let's see, the style image. So can we save the entire layout settings as a name style? So, okay, I see what Dave has this question about. Can we take the style and save the entire layout, entire setting, so it shows up as a menu choice? You know, we don't have that. And we have had, I know we've had people ask, you know, can I make my own default layout? There's no way to create kind of a layout set that you can choose from in that way. However, what you can do is a couple of things. First of all, you don't have to just copy one of these, even the axis settings. If you highlight all of these and do a copy on this, and then go to a different file or a different graph and paste, it will overwrite all the settings in the graph you pasted in with however they were set in the original graph that you started with. What I think is a good thing to recognize, or a useful thing to know, is that you can set up your own templates. So for example, I set up a user template file from user template, APA style bars. Now that I have this user template, I can just open this up, and now every other graph I create is going to have the same style as this one. So if I make a, I don't know, a plot, oops, I didn't want to do that here, and this new one, I'm going to make a plot of this data. Let me make my points a lot bigger. Now the size is does still get set to automatic, but the style of the graph is using whatever the style was from the one that I created here. So you could have multiple graphs even that you put in your own user template that use a style that you like and have those available to you. So I have one that I use for making thumbnails. I have another one, I don't know, I think I was just playing around here for bars. I have to admit, for me, I'm so used to using the style settings and where everything is, which, you know, after you use DataGraph for a while, you just know, oh, I want to change grid lines. I can just go here. Here's the options for grid lines. I'll change them there. So I tend to actually just always start with the default settings and then manipulate them as I like. But the user templates, I think, are a workaround, definitely, yes, that you can use. And we keep thinking about how to have default settings like that. I just feel like we haven't quite come up with a solution that we love. mean, one of the things is if you on your own have a certain style set that you set up, it's important to make sure that if you send that file to someone else, that they have all that style in there. So I don't know. Anyway, something that we will continue to think about and maybe come up with a more elegant solution. But for now, I think having a user template here, or creating a file that you keep as a shortcut on your desktop. There's someone that told me that he did that approach at one point, and that was kind of useful, where again, he had the style set up the way he wanted. Like in this one, for example, I think I changed the colors. So you can change the color menu to be whatever colors you like to use on a regular basis. And then you could have different user templates for different color schemes that you want to use. That would be one idea. Let me see if there's anything else. Let's see. I think that's it. Gosh, I really meant to record this webinar. I did not do that, which is too bad, because I think that this was pretty good, but that's okay. I think I'll just go ahead and record this as a video, and we'll post that as well for anyone else who didn't make it today. Let's see, a comment. It would be nice if the graph title could be read from a place in the data set instead of typing. That's something that, depending on what you're doing, you could have a graph title that comes from the data. I wonder if I have, in one of the online examples, in one of the data sets, a file that does that. This would be using a variable, for example. Yeah, you can have text variables, and let me think of if I have let's say, for example, I'm just going to try and see if I can do this on the fly. So say I have two data sets. I actually want this to be a text column. Let's make this set basic, call this basic 1, and then we'll have basic 2. Let's see if basic 2, and I'm just going to copy. I guess I could have done the whole thing, but okay. So say we had I'm actually not quite maybe I have to think about this. Maybe I can't do this quite on the fly. The set variable, I mean, I guess one thing I'll just show you is you can do text from column. So let's just look at that for a moment. So if I have text from a column and I want to use row 1 for my text set, I can say, here we go. So here's my title. And this actually would work better where you have a more complicated data set, where you actually have like more of a database setup. You have a data table, and then you have some descriptors of the data, and you're using it to kind of sort of filter the data. But here, what hopefully you can sort of see is that I can say I want row 1, that's going to be my title. And then in my graph title here, I can select a variable. So I click on my little plus symbol. I can select the variable called title. And now it's using the text that came from row 1. If I want to use the text from row 2 or row 5 is different, so I could type that in. And then the way that you could set this up to be dynamic is that the row number, can be a variable. So if you have 2 different data sets and you want to select between, data set 1 and 2, actually, this is kind of more how you would do this. Is, let's say I have a column divider. let me copy these, copy unique entries, make a text column. I'm going to drag, oops, over here, on the other side, and paste. Did I not copy this? Here we go. Copy unique entries. I'm going to, I guess I just have to do this through paste. And let's call this 1 and 2. So here, I just want this to be 1 and 2. I think there's a method to my madness. Let's see, set. So if I have let's see, we'll just use a value. Then I'm going to call this set, and I'm going to call this 1. And in this graph here, I'm going to say I only want to plot the data using a mask. If you've never seen these before, this is where we can filter what data goes into our graph. I'm going to say I want to say where set equals 1. Oh, sorry, set has to be here, a number. There we go. So now I have just this, I have it masked, so it's only going to use set equal to 1. And then here where I'm picking my title, I'm going to do this not from the data table, but from this lookup table here. So I want to use the column that's in the lookup table, and maybe we'll call this one name just so it's a little bit clearer. And the row here is going to be this set number variable. So now if I change this from 1 to 2, do you see how it changes my, oops, my title? So I'm filtering a different data set, and I'm changing this from 1 to 2. I actually don't know why the data is not changing, because I didn't set this to the actual variable. I have where set is equal to set. I have a lot of sets. I'm using the same name a lot here. So it knows to use the variable. Oh, there is no 3. So here's 1, here's 2. So I'm able to change the data, and I'm changing the title. Sorry, that was a little bit of a complicated maybe to get there, but hopefully you see where I got to. And the idea again would be that you're using this variable to select a text that's coming from a lookup table. If you want to send me your data to look at that, I'm happy to help you with that. I really appreciate everyone for attending today. I hope that you have a really nice weekend. Don't forget that DataGraph 5.4, it's not a monumental release, but there are some really nice things I think that you'll find in there. Some of the things I am using this version today. It is out in our beta, and it will be out on Sunday, I think is when we're on the 1st, we plan to pull the trigger. It might not be out on the App Store yet on that day, but it will be on our website, barring any strange unforeseen bug that we haven't anticipated. I think the version in the beta right now is very stable. We did add just a couple of little things, but I'm really looking forward to getting that version out there. And thanks so much for everyone for participating today. It was a fun webinar to give, and I appreciate your being involved and giving us feedback. It really helps to develop the program. And I don't think there's any other news to show. No, I think that's all I wanted to share. So thank you so much. And until next time, great.